John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was born into a Polish family on March 17, 1942. He was welcomed by two sisters, an auto machinist father, and a homemaker mother. Gacy's early life is just as complicated and nuanced as his criminal career, offering some background into his psychology and criminal motivations. One of Gacy's first memories is of his father beating him with a leather belt for disarranging car engine components. His father would continue this pattern of abuse, constantly belittling and abusing Gacy, saying he would grow up to be queer. At the age of 5, Gacy was being molested by a family friend in their truck. Shortly after, Gacy was caught with another young boy molesting a young girl and would receive the razor strop from his father. In the 4th grade, Gacy would begin experiencing frequent blackouts, which demanded several hospital visits. Gacy would later recount that between the ages of 14 and 16, he was in the hospital for nearly a year. His father would assume the illness was a farce to garner sympathy from his family, even going so far as to accuse Gacy of faking his own illness while he lay in a hospital bed. In 1960, at the age of 18, Gacy would begin a career in politics, being appointed the assistant precinct captain for the Democratic Party in his area. In the same year, Gacy's father would buy him a car, but it would remain under his father's name until Gacy was able to finish paying the car. This would take him several years to complete. Gacy's father would frequently take the keys away if Gacy did not do as he said. In April 1962, there was an altercation involving an extra set of keys for the vehicle, and his father ended up taking the distributor cap out of the car and holding on to it for 3 days. Upon returning the cap, Gacy would leave with the car to Las Vegas, where he would serve as a mortuary student for 3 months. During his 3-month stint, he would watch morticians perform embalmings, as well as serve as a pallbearer. During his employment, he slept in a cot that was behind the embalming room. One day, while he was alone, Gacy would climb into the coffin of a young man, embrace the corpse, and begin caressing the body. After feeling a sudden sense of shock, Gacy would call his mother and arrange to return home to Chicago. Shortly after, he would attend Northwestern Business College, despite having no GED. Gacy would graduate in 1963 and get a job as a manager in training. In 1994, he was transferred to Springfield, Illinois for a salesman position, and would eventually become the manager in his department. He would also go on to marry one of his co-workers, Marilyn Myers. That same year, Gacy would have his first homosexual experience. A fellow member of the Springfield Jaycees had plied John with drinks and performed oral sex on him. Upon marrying Marilyn, her father would purchase 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, and hired Gacy to manage those restaurants. The couple had moved into Marilyn's parents' house, who had vacated the house so those two could start their life together. After beginning to work in Waterloo, Gacy would open a club in his basement where employees could hang out and drink and play pool. At these gatherings, Gacy would only socialize with the male employees, giving them alcohol and making sexual advances towards them. Soon after, he would join the Waterloo chapter of the Jaycees, many of whom were involved in wife swapping, prostitution, and drug abuse. That very same year, Gacy would serve on the board of directors. Gacy later describes this period of his life as being perfect, as he had gained the approval of his father. Between 1967 and 1972, Gacy was involved in a string of sexual assaults and attempted sexual assaults, all involving young boys. His victims would be Donald Voorhees, Edward Lynch, and his first unnamed victim, who he had lured into his car and brought to his house. As part of his trial, Gacy was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. 2 doctors examined him over the course of 17 days, concluding he had antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for psychopathy or sociopathy, and is unlikely to benefit from any therapeutical or medical treatment. and that his behavior pattern would likely bring him into repeated conflict with society. November 7th, 1968, Gacy was sentenced for the sexual assault of Donald Voorhees, serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence, and will be released on June 18th, 1970. Gacy's wife left him shortly after the conviction. Gacy would never see his children again. After being released on parole, Gacy would relocate to Chicago and purchase a house with the help of his mother. Gacy would stay at this address until his arrest in 1978. Gacy was briefly remarried in the early 70s to Carol Hoff, and their divorce would be finalized in March 1967. Carol would frequently observe Gacy bringing young men home into their garage, and would frequently find gay pornography, men's wallets, and men's identification inside their house. Gacy also owned a construction company by the name PDM Contractors, operating from 1971 to 1978. The company was very successful, having an annual revenue of over $200,000 in 1978. Much of PDM's workforce was young men and teenage boys, many of whom Gacy would proposition for sex. In this time, Gacy would attack 3 more victims: his second unnamed victim, 15-year-old Anthony Antonucci, and 18-year-old David Cram. In the case of Anthony Antonucci, Gacy went to his house knowing he had injured his foot the previous day. The two drank a bottle of wine together and began to watch a pornographic film. Gacy wrestled Antonucci to the floor and attempted to put handcuffs on him. Luckily, Anthony was able to free himself and got the cuffs on Gacy. Gacy later recounted that Antonucci was the only one to ever get the cuffs off. David Cram was also an employee of Gacy, and on his 19th birthday, him and Gacy would have several drinks together to celebrate. Gacy tricked David into wearing handcuffs, then after flinging him around by the handcuffs, announced he was going to rape David. David then kicked Gacy in the face and was able to free himself from the handcuffs. Gacy's first known murder occurred on January 3rd, 1972. Gacy had lured 16-year-old Timothy McCoy into his car from a Greyhound bus terminal. Timothy had spent the night at Gacy's house, and in the morning made breakfast for himself and Gacy. Timothy had absent-mindedly gone into Gacy's room to wake him up, with the knife still in his hand. Gacy thought Timothy was attempting to kill him, so he twisted the knife from his hand, got on top of him, and stabbed him in the chest repeatedly. After killing Timothy, Gacy recounted that he felt drained, also noting that as he listened to Timothy's gurgulations and gasping for breath, he experienced a mind-numbing orgasm. Gacy would go on to commit more than 30 murders, most of which occurred between 1976 and 1978, and he would bury most of the bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. Gacy's usual modus operandi would consist of what he called the handcuff trick and the rope trick. Gacy would either ply a young boy with drugs and alcohol or gain their trust. He would then offer to show them a magic trick where he would handcuff himself behind his back, then free himself with a key hidden between his fingers. He would then offer his victim to show them how he did it by handcuffing their arms behind their back. And then he would begin to assault and torture his victim. His methods of assault included straddling the victim's chest, forcing his victim to fillet him. He would burn his victims with cigars. He would sit on the victim's back and make them imitate a horse. He would violate his victims with foreign objects, such as dildos and prescription bottles. He would frequently shackle his victims to a 2x4 with handcuffs attached at each end, inspired by the Houston mass murders. For several victims, Gacy would drag them to his bathroom, where he would partly drown them and repeatedly revive them to continue his assault. He would typically murder his victims by placing a tourniquet around their neck and progressively tightening the rope with a hammer's handle, informing the victim that this is the last trick. All but 2 victims were murdered between 3 and 6 a.m. Other common patterns in his murder were asphyxiation. 12 victims were found with cloth stuffed down their throat and evidence of asphyxiation. The disappearance and murder of Robert Piest was what led to Gacy's arrest. Gacy had lured Robert out of the pharmacy that he worked at with a job opportunity. P.S. had asked his mother, who had come to pick him up, to wait for him so that he could speak to Gacy about the job opportunity, and he was murdered less than 2 hours later. Robert's family had filed a missing persons report when he had failed to return to the pharmacy, and the store owner named Gacy as the man P.S. most likely left the pharmacy with. Lieutenant Joseph Kozenczak began to investigate Gacy further, becoming convinced that Robert did not run away from home after speaking with his mother. Kozenczak and 2 other police officers went to Gacy's home to question him after looking at his criminal background and seeing he served a prison sentence for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. When police had obtained their first warrant on December 13, 1978, they found several police badges, a pistol, a syringe and hypodermic needle, handcuffs, amyl nitrate capsules, an 18-inch dildo, a 39-inch 2x4 with holes drilled in each end, bottles of Valium and Atropine, several driver's license, a blue hooded parka, a pair of underwear too small to fit Gacy, a class of 1975 Maine West High School ring engraved JAS, a pharmacy photo receipt, and a 36-inch section of nylon rope. Confiscate Gacy's Oldsmobile and other PDM work vehicles, as well as beginning surveillance. Investigators would connect the high school ring to the murder of John Alex Sitz. By December 18th, Gacy would appear strained from the constant surveillance. The pharmacy receipt was connected to one of P.S. coworkers, who put the receipt in the jacket pocket before giving him the jacket. On December 19th, investigators would be invited into Gacy's house, one officer even noting a smell he suspected to be rotting corpses. One of Gacy's victims, David Cram, was interviewed by police, and when accounting the attempted rape, also accounted that Gacy had asked him to dig trenches, which he would later place the victims in. On December 20th, Gacy would go to his lawyer's office and deliver a rambling confession, confessing to murdering at least 30 victims. He would later describe his victims as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars whom he gave the rope trick. His lawyer would schedule a psychiatric evaluation for 9 a.m. the following morning, but Gacy would not attend. When police obtained a search warrant, officers found Gacy's basement flooded as he had turned off his sump pump. Upon draining the crawl space, investigators began digging and almost immediately began finding putrefied flesh and bones. On December 22nd, Gacy would confess to murdering approximately 30 young men, claiming all of whom entered his house willingly, also claiming not to know the names of his victims. He also confessed to having his employees dig trenches so that he would have graves available. Based on crime scene characteristics, I would say John Wayne Gacy is an organized killer, taking careful effort to hide his victims' bodies and using quicklime to accelerate the decomposition process. It is also evident by the many tools in his possession to facilitate his assaults: the 18-inch dildo, the 2x4 with holes drilled in each end, and several police badges, which he would use to trick his victims into thinking he was a police officer. Gacy also had several names for his methods: the handcuff trick, the rope trick, and doubles, where he would kill 2 victims in the same night. Another credit to Gacy's organization is that some of his victims were embalmed in his garage before being buried. In all, investigators found 29 bodies buried in Gacy's property, and 4 bodies found in the Des Plaines River were all connected to him. Gacy was, all in all, charged with 33 murders. David Cram, Donald Voorhees, Jeffrey Rignall, and Robert Donnelly, for all former sexual assault victims of Gacy, testified at his trial. He was found guilty of all 33 murders and subsequently sentenced to death. John Wayne Gacy was put to death by way of lethal injection ordered by the Supreme Court. Possible risk factors for John Wayne Gacy include the abuse he received at the hands of his father, as well as the family friend who molested him at a young age. According to an article by Nicola Davies, Ph.D., child sexual and psychological abuse are both associated with rape lust offender typologies, stating crime that is associated with childhood psychological abuse tended to involve torture. Crime associated with physical child abuse was associated with the rape lust typology, as well as having associated behaviors such as binding the body and leaving the body at the crime scene. The results also suggest that sexual abuse is associated with a tendency to overkill, evident by both prolonged torture and the number of his victims. This research concludes that John Wayne Gacy acted out his murders in the specific way that he did due to the trauma he experienced as a child at the hands of his father, who psychologically and physically abused him, as well as the family friend who molested him. In conclusion, John Wayne Gacy was a heinous murderer, responsible for the death and torture of 33 people, showing no to little remorse for his actions.